Serious. What was your creepy, unexplainable story as a child that was confirmed by your parents to have happened? Part 2. Please like and subscribe to support this channel. I'm late and this will probably never be seen, but when I was very young, maybe 3 at most, before I had any siblings, I was alone, playing with marbles, rolling them back and forth on the floor, and my favorite marble rolled under the couch. I reached my hand under the couch to try to find it, but couldn't. A moment after I pulled my hand back, a hand reached out from under the couch where mine had just been, groping around as if trying to find me. It was aged, wrinkly, and very dark-skinned. It groped around, then pulled back beneath the couch, then re-emerged, pushing some bits of plastic wrappers with it. I sat there, watching from a safe distance, not exactly scared, but aware that this was something that should not be happening. The hand waited by the trash for a moment, and I remember thinking, the trash is bait. It just wants me to try to take it so it can reach me. Then the hand pulled back beneath the couch, and then reappeared, pushing with it more trash. I distinctly remember a yellow, plastic package for Bic pens with that little logo of a man they have as one of the pieces of trash the hand offered. Then, when I didn't make any move to take the trash, the hand gathered it all up and retreated back beneath the couch. I sat there for a moment, waiting for something else to happen, and when nothing did, I got up, went and found my mom, and calmly told her that a hand had reached out to me from under the couch. My mom gave me a confused look and assured me that there was definitely no hand under the couch. She walked back to the living room with me and stuck her own hand under the couch to prove there was nothing to be afraid of. This worried me very much. Then, when my dad came home from work that evening, he lifted the couch up for me and I was able to retrieve my lost marble, along with several others I hadn't known I'd lost. The trash the hand had offered me did not seem to be underneath the couch, oddly. For the rest of my childhood, I was afraid of the dark spaces under furniture, and believed that a hand could reach out from them and pull me under, never to be seen again, but I thought that this experience had been just a vivid dream that I'd had. Then, when I was in my late teens, I was talking to my mom about dreams, and I mentioned this one to her. She told me that, no, this had actually happened. She remembered the day that I had told her about the hand under the couch, and she said that, though she had tried not to show it, it had disturbed her very much, because I wasn't the type of kid who made up stories or told lies. She said that she'd made sure that they threw that couch away soon after, because they'd bought the couch used, and the seller had informed her and my dad that an elderly black woman had died while sleeping on it. I still think about this, more than I'd care to admit. Even for a ghost story, it's bizarre, and I've never been able to make sense of it. Why did the hand offer me garbage? Was it trying to be helpful? If it was trying to bait me, why didn't it offer me my lost marble? Not that I would have taken it. The fact that this whole experience took place after I literally lost my marbles isn't lost on me, either. The whole thing honestly really traumatized me, and I still feel very uncomfortable even just typing it up. Was living with my mom, she was divorced. I kept talking to her about the other guy who lived in our house. He told me he was the roommate. My mom insisted he didn't exist. Shortly before we moved out, mostly because of this, she discovered we had a homeless guy living under our porch and I wasn't crazy. When I would be home alone after school, I was 6 to 8 years old, he would come in and hang out with me. Plus eat, shower, etc. when no one was home. When I was a baby my mom rented a house from a friend who claimed it was haunted. She didn't believe it until she would hear 1 to 2-year-old me sitting in my bed talking to 2 men that I had said lived in the ceiling. She said she always thought my older sister would leave the TV on, thinking that's where the voices came from, until she heard me speaking back in my baby, toddler talk to them. She said the last month we lived there, I was a little over 2, she was in the bathroom directly across my bedroom when she heard a man talking in my room. It was late, I was supposed to be asleep, and my mom says she just froze and listened. She says she couldn't understand what he was saying. Then the other man started talking and she was freaked out and praying I was asleep and the men were just breaking in and would come out and leave me alone. Then she heard me talking and she rushed in the room. She said she practically broke the doorknob, and sees nothing but me in my toddler bed. She said I looked at her with my bitchiest face and was mad. She said she asked me who was I talking to, and I told her, I was talking to the angels. Apparently I was pissed and pointed to the ceiling and just got so angry at her about her coming in. You made them go away. I don't remember any of it, to be honest, just what she told me. She believes in all those TV psychics and ghosts. I tried to hold back and not be the dick and show her how psychics are fake and ghosts are probably not real. I used to have night terrors, roughly age 8. Apparently it's fairly common in prepubescent boys. For those who don't know, a night terror is basically a very vivid nightmare. Screaming, flailing, extreme fear, and in my case appearing to be fully awake, eyes open and talking. I don't remember any of these episodes, but my parents and older sister do quite well. There was one in particular, usual screaming and whatnot, but when my mum came in to calm me down I was sat on the bed silent with fear pointing at the corner of the room. She asked what was wrong and I basically described a corpse floating there, as if suspended in water, and I was adamant it was there. This wasn't long after the 2004 Boxing Day tsunami and we think it was linked to seeing the news reports on it. My parents and I went camping for a week when I was around 5 or 6. We were staying in a woods that had a campground but you can set up camp anywhere inside it. My dad, brother and I, loving to fish, wanted to camp near the stream, so we set up camp deeper into the woods where the stream was. My parents were in a tent and my brother and I were in a tent. The second night I needed to go to the bathroom at night, so I got up and went outside to pee. Standing on the other bank was a person just looking at me. I went to a bush, did my business and went back to the tent to sleep. The next night I heard some splashing in the water and looked out and saw the person there again. I went to my parents' tent, got my dad, but by the time he came out the person was gone. The fourth night I was too scared to sleep and kept a lookout of the zipper on the tent and I saw this person standing on the bank again. I grabbed my flashlight and got out and shined it on him, but before I could get a better look he ran into the forest. I yelled for my dad and he once again didn't believe me. The fifth night I was begged my parents to let me sleep in their tent. Mom relented and let me. When they fell asleep I snuck up to the zipper to keep an eye out. When the guy came again I woke up my dad and showed him through the zipper. He saw the man, grabbed his gun and woke up my mom and told us to stay. I don't remember much other than my mom being terrified. What I do remember was 5 minutes later my dad came back. We packed up and left at like 12 at night. The whole thing was so surreal. As I grew up I thought it was a nightmare or something I saw on TV. I asked my dad about it a few years ago and apparently it happened. What happened after he got out the tent was he took the flashlight and shined it on the guy and he said it was a giant of a man who fled back into the forest, but as he stood there and swung the light around he kept seeing movement just a little beyond his vision, so he decided for us to leave, and as we packed up he kept the light and gun up over the stream and said he kept seeing him move around but couldn't make out any features. My dad had a home office in an unused bedroom across from his and mom's room where he ran a consulting business part-time. My brother and I had our rooms on another floor and really didn't go in there unless we needed to staple or hole punch something for school. Rare. The room had a big wooden desk, some file cabinets, and a long table that had printer, fax, etc. on it. One day, Dad was frantically tearing through the house. SND said he could not find his wallet. We pitched in, checking everywhere, and double-checking one another. We didn't find it. He checked the cars and drove to his full-time office to look. He didn't find it and resolved to keep checking. 2 weeks went by. He canceled the credit cards, bank cards, etc. He was getting stuff together to go to the DMV to get a replacement driver's license. I needed to sharpen a pencil and used the sharpener in his office. It was on the long table by the printer and stuff. Smack on the front, where no one could possibly miss it, was Dad's wallet. Who the heck knows where it was during those 2 weeks? When we moved, Mom and I went around opening the doors, drawers, etc. to everything so we wouldn't leave anything behind. A few weeks later, the new owner called and had a box of our important papers, BC's, medical records, their marriage certificate, etc. They'd found it sitting in an unfinished room in the basement. We never stored anything there because of moisture, especially not that stuff. I live in Colombia, and my father is a doctor, and while growing up, his main work was as hospital director of the most isolated hospitals in rural areas. The good thing is that you'll get used to weird sounds on the night, and the silent night watchers, mostly old folks, walking around without even a flashlight. Usually most of the hospitals we lived in were new and nice, until we got to an old town at the south of the country that was just partially renewed, and most of the construction was the old public, retirement home, sanitarium, if you could call it home, with a big part basically destroyed. Falling ceilings, broken walls, you get the picture. One of my hobbies was to spend the evening playing domino with the head nurse and the night watchman, and joining them on their night walks. One night I was with Pasquale, walking around one of the old areas, when I felt the urge to look back, and then, it was a white, gray shadowy figure in front of a boarded room that honestly always gave me the creeps. I remember holding his hand really hard, and that when he told me, just don't look, she loves to scare people, and if you look for too long, it can get inside you. At that point I honestly was more terrified of how calm he was, than the specter itself. The good thing is that I ended up building the courage to walk through a bush area behind the constructions where the ambulances used to park, just to avoid crossing near the damned room. Wasn't exactly a child, but I was still living at home with my parents. I've told this story somewhere else I think, so my apologies. A few years ago my grandfather was diagnosed with liver failure and was given a few months to live. My grandfather and I were always really close. We used to go for walks and take pictures together, but his ritual was anytime he had a visitor you had to play crib with him. Now I never understood how to play, so I'd always watch my dad play against him. It took a few months before his liver finally gave out and he passed away in his sleep. I had seen him the day before and told him it was okay to go, but he wasn't responsive at that time and it crushed me that I couldn't be with him when he did pass. A few days later I was in my room and found a blue crib piece. Our crib board had been missing for months. No one in my family really plays crib other than with my late grandfather. My bedroom door is always closed and this little peg was positioned directly to the side of my desk. No way it could have just accidentally rolled into my room. I asked my parents if they had been in my room. No. Had they used the crib board? No. They knew nothing about it until I showed them and both immediately got goosebumps. We believe it was my grandfather coming to say goodbye. My mum told me that she was once calling my dad, and was alone in the house. Suddenly she gets a bizarre chill down her spine. My dad immediately says, calmly, I quote my mum here, darling, start recording, nothing else. So she starts a video, and although there's clearly no one in the room and you can hear both my dad and my mum, there is definitely some loud breathing that neither person could hear but was picked up by the recording. And it was loud. Not at all tinny, so I don't think it was coming from the phone, and it continued in the same rhythm while my dad was speaking. When I get home from school I find a magazine on my bed. It was the August 1952. When I was around 2 to 3 years old, me, my parents and my then 5-year-old brother were having dinner in the evening. This was around the time I had just learned to speak in small sentences, and was able to express what I wanted to say properly. Then suddenly, out of nowhere, I started to say stuff like, Grandpa is in pain, or, Grandpa has pains. Of course my parents had no clue what I was talking about, since as far as they knew our grandpa was perfectly healthy, so they thought I was just saying some random sentences and didn't think about it too much. Until about 30 minutes later, the phone rang. It was the hospital. About the same time ago as I started saying that, my grandpa had a random heart attack and was hospitalized. Stuff like this happens more often in my family, but this was by far the most unexplainable. By the way, my grandpa had surgery and went on living a healthy life for another 17 years after this. My sister was staying with a boyfriend close to Beaufort, SC. The house was on what used to be a plantation 300 years ago. He built his house right, within 20 feet, of the workers' graveyard. The ancestors of those workers claimed the house was actually built on graves. Well, I went to visit several times and slept on the daybed in the living room. They slept upstairs. Every night I stayed I was disturbed by the sounds of people walking on the steps to upstairs. It also had clinking chains with the steps. I never slept well there. Well, she moved on and I would stay with her elsewhere in the same area and was never disturbed like this again. Really weird. The place gave me the creeps. Some of our family friends own a crazy old house in upstate New York that was actually part of the Underground Railroad. The house has a ton of history and secret passageways all throughout it. It's also haunted. Every time someone new comes to the house, weird things happen. My cousin has heard people breathing in his room at night when he visits, and the lady that owns the house constantly has to turn the TV off because the ghost, who they call Morton after one of the previous owners who had died in the house, turns it off. The youngest son tells a story where he was sitting in the kitchen and a large old china cabinet that was up against the wall where a door out to the backyard used to be, smoothly and silently swung forward like a door opening. He said it was just like someone was walking outside. Also, the youngest daughter slept in a room that had a hidden trapdoor underneath the floor for escaped slaves to hide in. Multiple times she has woken up to the rug covering the door flopped to the side like the door had been opened in the night. It's some crazy shit, but they all say that anytime Morton comes to visit it doesn't feel malevolent or angry. They say it feels like Morton is just living in his house still and they have to share it with him. They've lived there for 20-some odd years and have no plans of moving even in the middle of all this supernatural shit that's going on around them. I have an identical twin brother and we went to different colleges, 1,000 miles apart. This was back in the 1980s, so no email, cell phones, etc. Anyway, one day when I was a sophomore I broke my collarbone playing dorm football. That night I called my mom and told her and she said, "That is so strange because your brother called today asking if I had heard from you because he has been trying to get a hold of you all day because he had the weirdest feeling, premonition that you broke your arm." Note that neither my twin brother or I had ever broken a bone before, nor had either of us before, or since, made such a prediction. I can't tell you how many times people have asked me jokingly if we can feel each other's pain, but maybe in that one instance he somehow did. When I was a child I had lost all my memories when, according to my parents, I feel of the new balcony my dad was building at the time. From the day I got back from the hospital I would be visited by ghosts at night. It always felt like an angry spirit that hated me, but I did not know why it was only happening to me. The ghost would scare me and terrorize me to the point where I would cry myself to sleep every night. And one night I felt so helpless and alone that I just yelled out, "Please stop. I just don't want to be sad anymore," and then after that night it all just stopped. A few years later I started hearing footsteps in my room at night but did not associate it with my prior experiences. And one night I got fed up and was about to swing a fist in the direction of the noise, but I was stopped mid-swing. When I looked to my side I saw a very young boy, around 4, soaking wet. It took me a second to comprehend, but when I reached my hand out to see if he was real, he was solid. I then got up and then put the boy on my bed and wrapped him in a blanket because when I picked him up he was very cold. And as I am picking him up I am asking him things like, "Who are you? How did you get in? Are you hurt?" etc. But all he kept saying was he was sorry for being mean to me, he was just very angry at me. At this point I am very confused, so I tell him to sit still while I go wake up my parents. I go to their room and tell them and they have a look of mild irritation on their faces. But when I got to my room I instantly fell to the floor. The boy was gone. And just to clarify, my parents' room was just down the hall from mine, so I would have seen him leave. For a moment my parents thought I was crazy, but they could see what looked like a child's wet footprints going from my door to my bed. And the blanket was still in the outline of a small person. They asked me what the boy looked like, and when I told them their faces went pure white. They sat me down in the living room and opened an old photo album and pointed to a young boy. It was him. I asked who he was because in the photo I could see me and this boy playing. They went on to tell me that he was my twin brother that had died many years ago. And at that moment all the memories came flooding back. I remember the day he died. We were playing in a field across from my house. We were arguing and I made him run home. The moment he was in the road he was hit by a car and died on impact. I remember that for a long while I was very depressed and that I kept hearing his voice in my head. And then the final memory. The day I fell off the balcony. I remember hearing his voice and following it. When I got to the balcony I could see him. He called to me and I ran towards him at full speed. After my parents realized I had lost my memory they had decided to keep what happened with my brother a secret from me because they thought it would be best. So yay, hectic shit. I was 19 watching my parents' house in the middle of nowhere while they were out of town. It was chilly, late fall, and I wearing PJs pants and t-shirt and fuzzy socks. I locked up for the night. It was a small house, 3 doors to the outside. One was a slider door in guest room I was staying in. I sat in bed around 8:30 p.m. to read a book for a few hours. I got maybe 4 pages in, when I woke up yelling outside of the guest room, knocking on the door, trying to get inside the house. I was naked, the doors to the house were all still locked, no windows were open, unlocked, and the light in my room was still on. My legs and feet were dirty and scratched, like I had been running through the woods. And I had to dig through the trash can to grab a cat food can lid to break the lock and get in. When I finally got inside, it had been maybe a half hour since I woke up and it was around 3 a.m. I never found my book in PJs and have never before and never since then had a time where I didn't remember falling asleep or blacked out. I had been eating at home, didn't drink or do drugs, and couldn't explain how I got out of the house or where the 6 hours went. I don't feel like I had been raped and had no wounds or bleeding except the scratches on my legs and feet. I told my family, and my had brother stayed in that room a few weeks prior and said he saw weird lights outside the window and had heard someone knocking at one point, but chalked it up to his imagination and never told anyone. I am the parent in this story. When we bought our current house, my daughter was 5. In our previous house, if she'd wake up in the middle of the night, she'd build a pile of her blankets and pillows in our room and wake up in her nest. In the new house, she started building the piles in her own room, but she'd wake up on her stripped bed. When asked, she insisted that the nest was for her friend Rose. She had actually had an imaginary friend named Dee Dee, so a new one didn't surprise us much. She would tell us about Rose waking her up at night and wanting to rest, so she'd build a nest for her on the floor and go back to bed. Years later, and a sweet old neighbor, niece of the cattle rancher who built the house at the turn of the century, told us about his first wife who died in the house of sepsis poisoning. Her name was Rose. My grandma died almost exactly a decade ago. She always had bad lungs and pneumonia finally got her. I went home for the week and stayed at their house with my grandpa. We were really worried about him. If she went first, she died on a Monday, the funeral was Friday, so on Wednesday night, I'm watching the news and realize the remote batteries are dying. Talking my grandpa through this later would be a bad idea, so I go searching for some batteries to change. They usually kept batteries in the dining room on a bookshelf. I go to the dining room and smell an odd smell in the middle of the room. Like dust burning when you first turn on the furnace for the winter, with fragrance. Like lavender or something. Grandma wasn't one for perfumes and they didn't really do potpourri. The smell was concerning because of the burning nature, but also calming. But my grandpa is in a wheelchair and I got concerned about an electrical fire, so I start checking outlets and such. I even went down to their basement and check under the room. The furnace was under a different room some distance from the smell. The smell was only in that one spot, in that room, not under the room either. I couldn't find anything amiss. I went upstairs and my grandpa asked me what was going on. I told him about the smell. He said his old man nose didn't smell much anymore. He had been in the kitchen the whole time, taking care of nightly medications. He rolled into the dining room and pointed out other outlets to check and such things. We found nothing. The smell eventually just dissipated, I guess. Friday, after the funeral, I told my uncle, a very practical man, and a math teacher, about it all, but as a, you might want to get an electrician to check the house, thing. He said if it had been an electrical fire, smolder, we would have been dead by then. He said, I think it was Grandma. Him being such a practical man, that hit hard. She did spend a lot of time in that room. She loved looking out the front window while on the phone with another elderly neighbor, gossiping about the young lady across the street who was having an affair with the man who lived behind my grandparents. It was a whole thing. We had tons of family meals there. A few days later, before leaving town, my now husband and I went to her grave. I smelled the smell immediately after getting out of the car. It was like a cloud around me that moved with me. My husband couldn't smell it at all. We left, drove back to my mom's town about 8 miles away. That smell stayed around me for half that drive and then it drifted off. Peacefully. I was left feeling like I had been given a good hug. The best way I can explain it. Years later, I was telling my family about this and my stepdad admitted to smelling it too, earlier that Friday, the day of the funeral. He mentioned it to whoever was around then, but no one else could smell it. Everyone was so busy then, they all kind of shrugged. But he described it exactly like I did. A few weeks ago, on the 10th anniversary of her death, I went to the grave to leave some flowers and I smelled it. It was more faint, but just as oddly comforting. Not a creepy story. But still. When I was about 2, my mother said I quit speaking over the course of a few months. Apparently I would only make animal noises and I quit speaking completely eventually. Of course doctors were consulted and after many tests it was determined that I had gone almost completely deaf. Fortunately I eventually got my hearing back before I had to start school. Now here is where it gets creepy. During that time, according to my mom, my animal noises were eerily accurate. She was okay until she found me outside, talking to the bull in the field next to us. She said she could swear she was watching a conversation and the bull was answering. She was freaked out but just wrote it off as an animal showing interest in a child. Then it happened with a squirrel. One evening it was an opossum. Then a blue jay. Cats and dogs. It really terrified her and she eventually got in between a conversation with another bird by physically picking me up and carrying me away. I started screaming and yowling in protest, and the old tomcat that lived with us came out of nowhere and tore into her legs until she put me down. She had the scars the rest of her life and never let me forget it. I was a freaky child. This is only one thing. In the very early 1980s, my parents were driving from our town in Scotland to Bristol, in the southwest of England. I was asleep in the back when this happened, but apparently as my mother was driving along a road that ran past a wooded area, two white glowing silhouettes of what she said looked like two little girls holding hands suddenly ran out in front of the car. My mother braced herself to steer sharply to avoid them, but it seems my dad told her to brake, but not to steer away, and to keep following the road. They didn't stop the car, they didn't hit anything, and they didn't see anything in their mirrors as they drove on. When they related their story to their relatives the next morning, they learned that two little girls had been killed on that stretch of road some time before. 15 years old, I'm driving on Route 66 in Oklahoma with my mom in the passenger seat. We are between towns, so I'm probably going 55 miles per hour. This was 1988. Not any traffic around us at all, so I'm in the right lane. Suddenly a pickup passes me on the right side, on the shoulder, and veers off the road, down an embankment. At 60 miles per hour, there's no way this pickup just smoothly drove down this sloped area and peacefully stopped without wrecking or rolling over. We both looked back and the pickup was just gone. No sign of a wreck, no dust being kicked up, nothing. It was so strange and unexplainable. Mom and I just gave each other the, "What the hell was that?" look, and I just kept on driving. We discussed it once, maybe 3 years later she still remembered it too. No clue what the hell we saw that day. As a child, I had the same nightmare over and over. I dreamed that a group of evil men wanted to burn down our small town. They came to our neighborhood at night, they laughed and screamed, "Haha, which one should we burn first? Let's go kill some people, etc." And every time, my parents grabbed me and my brother. We ran in our pajamas to the forest. It was terrible. We had nothing to eat, it was so cold. I told my mom about this when I was 9. She turned pale. She told me this happened to my grandfather in 1945 in Germany. He was 5 years old. After Germany has lost WW2, Russian PPL came to the small village where he lived. They tried to kill all Germans as a punishment for starting WW2. The family of my grandfather had to flee overnight. They spended their first night in a dark forest, in their pajamas. They had to flee very fast, they couldn't take any from their belongings. He and his family survived, they joined a group of other survivors. It was very traumatic for my grandfather. They walked 30 miles in their pajamas to their relatives, they had nothing to eat. They almost starved to death. Until this day, we don't know why I had these nightmares. Nobody ever told me about this. My grandfather doesn't talk about it. The similarity is so creepy. Dude, I hope I'm not too late. When my parents got divorced and I was in middle school, they bounced around houses a lot. My dad was renting this house that was pretty nice and in a normal upper middle class neighborhood. One day I'm playing Kingdom Hearts 2 and out of the corner of my eye I see my dad walk into the living room, pass to the right of me, go into the kitchen, then walk back into his bedroom. A few minutes later, I don't know why I even asked this, I wasn't scared or even consciously paying attention to what my dad did when he walked into the living room. I walked into my dad's room and was like, "Hey, you just walk into the kitchen for something?" He looked at me with wide eyes and he immediately got goosebumps and was like, "No." "Why?" And I was like, "I thought I saw you walk into the kitchen." He told me he'd seen the same thing out of the corners of his eyes ever since he moved in. He was fucking shook. Like, I'm not kidding. We moved out pretty shortly after, nothing's happened since. That house was suspect. Back as a kid 7-ish years old, my parents bought an old 1900s era villa that they moved an hour from its original place to their land, and restored it. Ornate pillars, arches in the central hallway, all the ornate and molded patterns in the roof around light fittings, that were around 3 meters high, 12 ft ceilings or something like that. Hanging steel counterweights on rope in the window frames for vertical sliding windows and so on. When we viewed it before it was cut in half and moved. The place was totally cleared out. Walls, floors, roof and not much else was left. There was an old dude probably in his 80s in a tall wing-back chair in front of the windows in the front room sitting like a statue with a newspaper that ignored me when I tried to talk to him from the doorway behind him. Figured he was a grumpy old man that ignored kids. Wouldn't be the first guy like that I'd met. I asked my mom who he was and why he was just sitting in a chair in the middle of the room. She told me not to be silly and took me back to the now empty room, which totally baffled me. Fast forward, and after moving in, things got a tiny bit strange at night. We had an external diesel water boiler for heating water for radiators in each room for heating. Butte pipe work all under the floors for circulating the water. Each night there was creaking, every second for 15 to 20 minutes at a time, like wood on wood tapping going room to room. I was told it was the heat in the water heating the pipes as it circulated, but I know now that it took at most 5 minutes to get the entire system from cold to hot, not some slow and long process. The kicker to the creaks was the footsteps up and down the hallway slowly most nights. Clear as day, going past the doorways but with no one making them. Being kids, my sister 5 to 6 and me 7 to 8 shared a room, and at night before going to bed sometimes my dad would poke his head in the doorway to make sure we were asleep, and tell us off if we were not. Game Boy was more important than sleep though. We had a desk lamp in the hallway outside our room so we could get around without turning lights on to get to the bathroom at night, etc. But it also silhouetted my dad when he looked in. I remember the first time seeing the silhouetted man standing looking in the doorway. I'd had never, and have never since, just completely locked up in fear, unable to move or look away. The man was much shorter than my giganto dad, and taller than my, rather short mum. As time went on you'd wake up feeling watched and he'd look in for a few minutes, usually looking from left to right at both out beds, and sometimes wave, as if to say, go back to sleep, and then silently, and stiffly walk on down the hallway towards the room I originally saw the man in the wing back in. For many years that room was empty except a lounge suite. My parents' room, lounge, was further into the house. As time went on it was a little less creepy, and sometimes you'd see him out the corner of your eye, through the doorway, standing still in the hallway just looking in at you. Creeps me out to this day that everyone knew he was chilling going through his house. Never stopped until we moved out and moved the house off-site again, 15 odd years later. After moving out my sister brought up the man in the doorway when we were kids. Confirmed by my parents too as the guy keeping an eye on his house. I've never believed in ghosts etc., but man, there is no other way I could explain or rationalize the ongoing experiences, seeing and getting waves and so on from something that seemed to exist as much as it didn't exist. I am the first and only grandchild, so my grandma was very fond of me. She was always planning birthday parties for me, and every year she said she couldn't wait for me to turn 15. It's very celebrated in my country. When I turned 9 I told her she wouldn't make it till then, and that in fact, she would only be there for my 10th birthday. She passed away exactly 2 weeks after I turned 10. My whole family still remembers it to this date. My sister passed when I was in 2nd grade. She was in kindergarten. My dad had spent a good chunk of the summer digging a large berm and yard on the side of my house toward the road. Planted a few trees, installed lighting, and placed a hand-painted 4 feet tall angel in the middle. Cora's space. We decided to release helium-filled balloons that next year on her birthday as a coping mechanism, obviously. Watched them sail off into the sky together as we said a few nice words. One of them was a Pocahontas balloon, as that Disney movie was released the year before her passing. She loved that film. 2 days later the balloons resurfaced, including the Pocahontas balloon wrapped around one of her trees in her memorial. Always stuck with me and members of my immediate family. There is something else out there besides us. I grew up in a Pentecostal household, so it was strict with me not being able to wear shorts as a boy, watch TV, women couldn't cut their hair or wear makeup, etc. Needless to say I knew nothing about the world outside of what happened at church and school. When I was about 5 or 6 I had a crazy dream where I was in Las Vegas for some reason and had gambled all my money away as an adult and had my head down on the table in distress or crying or something. I feel a very comforting hand touch my shoulder as if to reassure me everything was going to be okay. Now mind you, like I said, I didn't have a TV and had not been to the movies, so I had no idea how at that young of an age I would even know Las Vegas existed. I wake up and in the corner of my room I see what I swear was an angel looking down on me from the ceiling. I called out to my mom but was too scared to be loud enough. After that it's all fuzzy, but I swear I really saw it, and my parents think I may have since they were so religious. Still not sure how a 5 to 6-year-old would know about gambling and such. I'm 46 now and still think about it. Between the age of 5 and 10, I would randomly wake up at my grandparents' house. We lived only 6 blocks away. When I was a teenager it was confirmed that, as a child, I had an issue with sleepwalking. I knew where my grandparents' house key was kept. Don't get me started about security, it was the 80s in a small town. I would go to bed normally in my home, and in the middle of the night walk to my grandparents' house without knowing. Unlock the door, go to the couch or sometimes my old room, birth 4 they raised me, and lay on the floor until morning. Not exactly creepy. But my mom took me to some fair or festival in the woods when I was around 3 or 4. It was night, and someone gave me a sparkler. I was probably swinging it around like a little asshole, because one of the little sparks came back and burned the top of my hand. I started crying, but there was really nothing my mom could do. An older man came up to us and asked my mom what happened. She explained and he asked if he could take away my pain or something. What he said confused my mom, but she must have given him the go-ahead. He took my hand with the burn, and held it in both of his for a moment. When he pulled his hands away, the pain and the burn mark were gone. I thanked him, and my mom asked what he did. He just said he took my pain, and then held up his hand. On the back of his hand was a small, fresh burn. I used to have this recurring nightmare when I was around 11 to 12-year-old, 34 now. I would be asleep in bed, bottom bunk, and a giant drilling machine, the one from the original Total Recall movie to be specific, would crash through the wall causing the bed to collapse on me. I was terrified every time, I thought I was going to die. Then I would wake up. After having this dream for the 3rd time I brought it up to my mom. I could tell from her face that this was no ordinary dream. She sat me down and told me that when I was 4 a drunk driver crashed through our house, almost killing me. I broke my femur and had a severe concussion. I didn't remember any of this, still don't. She never brought it up because I never did and the memory of it for her is still horrific. Oddly enough though, after she told me I didn't really have that dream anymore except maybe once. Kind of hard to remember at this point. I can give you one that happened to my children. My identical twin sons once had the same dream at the same time. I had to make a 6 hours round-trip drive. I didn't have a sitter, so the kids came along with. They slept for most of the drive. About halfway back home, I stopped at a rest area. I decided I should wake them up to go to the bathroom. I turned around to wake them and before I said anything, they both perked up a bit and opened their eyes. They started talking in perfect unison. "Dad, we should tell you about the dream we just had." We were driving down the highway and we saw 3 piles of bones. One was me, one was my Bubba, and one was my full name. I tried talking to them, but it was like they couldn't hear or see me. They were 3 years old at the time. Bubba is how they said, brother, and I was, Dada, to them. I'm not even sure how they knew my first and last name. I am convinced they were both sleeping when they said that. Even now, 6 years later, if one of them has a nightmare, I'll go into their room to comfort them. They will sit up and kind of wobble back and forth with their eyes glazed over, and tell me about the dream. But when I talk to them, they can't hear me. I was so shook up there was no way I could have safely driven at that moment. We sat there in the parking lot for 20 minutes or so then I finished the drive home. I still wonder if we were going to die that day. Big yikes. I had a neighbor friend who had sexual experiences with her cousin of the same age when we were super young. Like under 10 young. I told her mom and the mom freaked out and called me a liar. Made a huge scene about how my parents let me watch rated R movies because they aren't in the church and that I made it all up for attention and made me apologize to her daughter in front of my mom. Fast forward 20 years and I had some memory loss, so I was telling my mom about this weird memory I didn't know if it was real. Where that girl told me about seeing her cousins P***NIS and how they would feel each other up at family sleepovers and how I always thought she was assaulted or something but have this weird memory of being called a liar and being forced to apologize for repeating what my friend had told me. My mom remembered and told me it all happened. I'm pretty sure the incest really did happen because I remember being so confused about why my friend didn't just tell her mom the truth. I've been waiting to see something like this. When I was still in high school my dad would yell for me whenever he got up to make sure I was up as well in the mornings. We left the house at about the same time in the mornings. Well, one night while I was dead asleep I could have sworn I heard him call my name as if I'd slept in. So my brain panics and I let out a half asleep, yeah, to let him know I'm up. Turns out it was about 2:30 a.m. He comes in my room all panicked and started asking if I had stayed up that late. Why was I up, etc. But he just had this panic about him that I couldn't understand. Turns out he was having nightmares where all he was doing was yelling my name over and over again, then woke up to me yelling, yeah, back at him. Luckily my stepmom was up with my little brother and can attest that my dad didn't make any real life noises or talked in his sleep, and my response came out of nowhere. I still don't get it, he doesn't get it, but I've done enough playing around with my brain to know there's bound to be something that happened that we just can't understand. I was raised solely by my mother. As a 6-year-old child, I frequently had a dream where I was a man. I was riding a motorcycle in full gear along the side tall cliff. Or what looked like one to a younger me. I was going too fast and made a sudden turn. As I rounded the bend, a semi pulls out of seemingly nowhere coming towards me in my lane. I make a sharp turn to try and save myself but realize I'd go over the side of the cliff. I overcorrect and end up sliding under the semi while the driver attempts to gain control of his own vehicle. I feel my knee hit the pavement and hit my head on something underneath as I fall off the bike. The wheels approach. I stopped having the dream when I was 10 and stopped thinking about it. But I had told my mom about the dream at least 100 times by that point. When I was 17, my father was finally tracked down by child support agency and we found out he was the man in my dream. He was crippled from the waist down in an accident that went exactly like that. He spent a few years in a coma, which would have been from the time I was 6 till I was 10. He still wanted nothing to do with me after and begged to not be held responsible for child support, and we let him off. I wanted nothing from him at that point. I was, however, amazed I so clearly had been able to describe the events that happened to him even without having ever met him.